Welcome to Redbeard Radio. I'm Brian Keith, and today we have for the fourth time Charles Gaudet of Predictable Profits and the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. He was first on back on episode 26 about when he was at the Army War College, and then episode 34 about going beyond seven figures, and then episode 156 last year back in 2022 about how to profit in a recession. Charles is back talking with us today about the economy, recessions, your mindset, and your perspective about what is happening and how you should respond to it to keep on growing your company. Charles, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Wow, 4 times. It's amazing. Now, I feel like we're going to have to, make a record here. We're going to have to keep going and going and going.
Well, yeah, no one has been on the show more than 4 times.
Woo!
And the first time you were on February, think about this, it was February 25th, 2020 was when episode 26 went live, which means we recorded it in late 2019. And so it's an artifact of the pre-pandemic world, as is How to Go Beyond Seven Figures, that episode that released in 2020 as well. But your next episode released in 2022, How to Profit in a Recession, was from the during pandemic world. That was probably recorded early 2022 when things were still interesting. And now here we are, we're recording in June 2023. And what you're talking about now is how do you judge what is actually happening in your industry? We're in this interesting transition time where some people are saying, oh, everything's about to blow up. Oh, there's been 3 bank failures. Oh, the dollar's collapsing. Bitcoin's collapsing. Other people are saying, wow, opportunity everywhere. I've never seen so many offers. How do I decide where to invest? There's so much opportunity. What are you seeing, Charles?
Well, what I'm seeing is both sides of the conversation, right? I'm seeing those people who are focused on every reason why their business should be struggling and they're struggling, and others who are focusing on every reason why their business should succeed and they're thriving. One of the funny things, Brian, is that as you were bringing up that timeline, right before 2020, I gave a keynote presentation and we were talking about how we're seeing an economic recession begin to take form. And that was before 2020. So it was already in the making.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in the making because we noticed that people were taking longer to make buying decisions. It wasn't that we knew that there was going to be a pandemic. We just knew that there was already a topping happening in the market. And then all of a sudden 2020 happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then as 2020 happened, we started telling people, why is now the best time in the world for you to be in business? Because there's so much opportunity everywhere. And we saw companies in the same industry having totally different results. We had the majority of restaurants that were struggling, and then there were very few restaurants, but that were thriving beyond the wildest imagination. In fact, I was having dinner at one of my clients' restaurants, and he said to me, Charlie, the crazy thing is that if God came down and told me I gave you the pandemic as a gift, I would have believed him, because our restaurants never did better than in a recession because they learned how to pivot and adapt. And we saw the same thing in the travel industry. We saw companies in 2020 that were going out of business in the droves, and then another travel company that literally became the number one company in his entire niche. And then just last week when I spoke to him, he still confirmed that he's still number one in the world in his niche, again, because it's all about pivoting. Now we look into today's economy. And in today's economy, we're in the same thing. It's woes about AI, and then there's excitement about AI. There's woes about the economy, and then there's excitement about the economy. The one thing that is crystal clear is that if you do not adapt your strategy, if you do the same thing that you did back in 2022 and expect that to work in 2023, then you are going to struggle. No matter how good your mindset is and everything else, you actually are going to struggle. But the reason why mindset and your strategy have to go hand in hand is because when you truly believe that the economy that we're going into right now can provide you with some of the greatest opportunities that you have experienced up to date in your lifetime, what happens is when you believe that, you begin to see opportunities that other people are missing. And in doing so, that's when you start to adapt and change and evolve. And fundamentally, we know that from our data, around November of 2022 is when things started to shift. We went from a buyer acquisition phase to a customer demand phase. It's really the first time that we've been on like demand creation in many, many, many years, where it's really all about demand creation more than it is about customer acquisition. And the reason why that is in a customer acquisition or a buyer acquisition phase, people are a lot less discerning and they turn around and, they make decisions relatively quick and the sales cycle is small. But in a demand creation phase, consumers are a lot more discerning. And so therefore it requires more customer education, more top of mind awareness, and so forth to create that demand creation. But when your mindset changes and you're looking for opportunities, you begin to find all these different ways in which you can educate, inform, and be useful to your clients.
I was once driving along in the desert and my engine crapped out. And thankfully, I was next to an off ramp. Ended up getting to coast to a stop underneath an overpass in the middle of nowhere in the desert. And partner of the car there said, "So what's going on?" So I started tootle around in the engine trying to figure out what's going on here. And she points out, "Are you out of gas?" I'm like, no, I can't be out of gas. I don't run out of gas. Only idiots run out of gas. Of course, I'm out of gas. But so I got a ride into a nearby gas station with somebody to go get a gallon of gas like an idiot that I was. But I only ever ran out of gas one other time in my life, and there happened to be an overpass right there. And I could look at, man, you're out of gas, you're an idiot. Or you could look at, wow, you got a good experience that is going to protect you from something bad happening in the future. And my chances of running out of gas have gone down because now twice in my life I've run out of gas.
Right. Well, there's so many stories throughout life, whether it's Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, where he survived the Holocaust largely because of his mindset. Now, of course, there's many other reasons, and luck does play a part of it, but mindset was a massive, massive component there. You and I were speaking before we pressed play about Arnold Schwarzenegger and the difference between what made him the number one bodybuilder in the world, at one point the number one actor in the world, and at one point California's top governor. And all of that really came down to mindset. And, I can't emphasize this enough because mindset sets the basis behind what you receive as information and what you put out there. And I spoke to an individual last week, and he was talking about every reason why he felt AI was going to put his company out of business. And then right from there, he talked about how people aren't buying anymore.
Huh.
And he just kept going on and on and on. And it reminded me of that old, was it Henry Ford's quote? It said, if you think you can or you can't, either way, you're right. And I'm like, okay. I said, well, it sounds like at this point, you might as well just cut your losses and close up shop. He says, really? Is that what you're seeing everybody else doing? I said, no. Actually, I can point to a number of different clients in the exact same industry that are having their best year that they have ever experienced, ever. But that's because they believe it's possible and they made the changes required to make that happen. It just depends on where you want to take this. And Brian, maybe I've had, too much caffeine today because I'm on a little bit of a rant. But, when I started my podcast, I started this podcast, the Beyond Seven Figures podcast, and I thought to myself, this is great because I'm going to bring in some of the smartest people on the planet. I'm going to bring them on this podcast. I'm going to pick their brains, and they're going to tell me even better strategies and tips and ideas and all this other stuff for taking companies beyond seven figures. That was like the real core motivation. And while we did get a lot of that, if you summarize all the different episodes and say, what is the number one biggest attribute to the most successful people on the podcast, they're all going to come back and say, you know what? It all came down to my mindset.
Well, I have a story. So 6 years ago now, I was very briefly married. And then that woman decided to be done being married to me. And so, you get divorced right after your honeymoon. And I was a total mess. You knew me back then, complete mess. And I felt so sorry for myself. And then I talked to more guys, and some guys, and I thought, well, oh, she left just after we got married. Oh, woe is me. I'm unusually burdened by a life. And I talked to more and more guys who their wives had up and left after a decade, 20 years, 50 years. And I got some perspective and I realized, wait a minute, I'm really blessed that it turns out that I knew guys who didn't talk about it much, but 50 years of their life just poof. And they weren't young anymore. And they couldn't go build a family with somebody else anymore. And actually, I was blessed but I did not understand it at the time. And then we go forward to 2022. My first child is born, and she passed away before she was born, for the folks who've not heard that story, 7 weeks before her due date. So stillbirth, could hold her in my arms, look at her face, hold her hand, all that. And stillbirth is a horrible thing, even though it's pretty common. We just don't talk about it because it's a horrible topic. But found out later that she had Down syndrome. And Down syndrome kills most of the kids who have it before they're born. Of those that are born, most of those die in their first year of life because their hearts just they're not enough to handle the world.
Wow.
And only a tiny percentage do you see out walking around. You do see some out walking around. So we think about, oh, Down syndrome, that's like the people with the faces, right? Or who don't speak quite right. Well, yes, but that's like a tiny percentage. But here's the thing, Charlie. There are some people just like me whose kids did survive till birth with Down syndrome and who then spent a year in the neonatal ICU, never being able to properly sleep, spent a year fighting for life and then dying.
Wow.
Am I worse off because I never got to see my daughter's eyes? Or am I better off because she never suffered in that way? Or is it impossible to compare? For anyone out there who's lost a kid, you've had similar thoughts, and whether it was a stillbirth, a miscarriage, an infant death, and you've probably had every different thought available to you about, how am I going to look at this? Is this a blessing? Is it because your kid was injured in some way where they would not be able to survive, or they would have suffered greatly if they had been born alive? Or is this a curse because this was a child that, of course, you wanted your child in whatever fashion they came in? Or is it impossible to judge? But the meaning you take from that, the approach you take from that, that really defines your reality. Because I'm sure there's some people out there who lost their child the same day I did, and under the same circumstances, who probably opened a bottle. We know that losing a child along with divorce, but especially actually the worst way or the most common outcome to become an alcoholic is if you have a child with disabilities.
Wow.
That's how marriages split up. That's how people start becoming alcoholics, because seeing your kids suffer is horrible.
Yeah.
And so there's someone else out there who had a slightly different environment than me, or they're a slightly different person in some way, and they did choose alcohol to numb this pain.
Sure.
Instead of saying, wow, this is happening. Me, I said, wow, I'm really out of control of the world. I thought I knew what was going on. Turns out I don't. What can I control? One of the only things I could control after my daughter died was not drinking alcohol. That was it. Everything else was out of control. So I chose, okay, this is one thing I can do. That's what I'm going to control. And that idea, coming out of a particularly painful part of my life, well, yeah, that does apply to everything. And it applies to our businesses. The outside business environment, you have no control over that, and you never will. But you can sure control what you're looking for, and whether you choose to feel doomed or whether you choose to feel optimistic.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, that being a dad of three, just hearing that story is just hits a heart hard.
I still don't drink. I was at a friend's house. He offered me wine. I said, oh, I don't really drink since my daughter died.
That's awesome.
And it's just this thing I can control in a world where we can't. But we think we can control things. That's the problem, right? The problem is not that we're out of control. The problem is we think that we aren't. The problem is that we fantasize that we can control how our teams work. We can control our sales process. We can control the environment. But our control is actually much more limited than that. But we don't invest in understanding and how to control what we can control, like changing our morning routines to be optimal, or what we eat, or how we talk to our spouse, these things that are so much within our control.
Yeah.
We instead try to go control other people and make them behave certain ways, which mostly doesn't work. But we have a lot of control over mindset.
Yeah. I was, many years ago, I met this gentleman called Dr. John Demartini. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant man. And Dr. John Demartini, I sat with him for a weekend. I've met with him several times, but in this particular case, I sat with him for a weekend. We were at a seminar, and he was scientifically proving the concept of the yin yang, how every positive has with it an equal opposite negative. And he went all the way down to the smallest observable molecule out there and showed that there's a positive and negative. And he said, look, the one thing that science will agree is that we as human beings are nothing more than energy. And the smallest observable piece of energy is that there's always a positive and negative. And then he went on to talk about how yesterday's deserts were today's rainforests and so forth. So that, there's this, positive and negative that happens all across that, bullish markets later become bearish markets and so forth. And there's always this back and forth, yin yang. And he had mentioned that, again, with every opportunity comes with it an equal opposite challenge. With every challenge comes with it an equal opposite opportunity. And they actually start forming at the exact same time. And there were several different people that stood up and asked questions. One particular gentleman said, I don't understand how that happened. I was molested as a child by the babysitter, and I don't see anything positive that came out of it. So DeMartini said, well, it's much too long ago for us to recollect what happened back then. But can I ask you a question? What are you doing right now? What's your occupation? And he said, I'm a pediatrician. He says, do you love what you do? And he goes, absolutely. He says, why'd you become a pediatrician? And that guy goes, wow, it was that event. And so he went into a much deeper discussion, but he began to see the positive. And this other woman, raised her hand, and, I dare I even discuss this on a podcast, but she raised her hand and she was talking about how she was, brutally raped in the back of her car. And I'm not going to go into too many details, but, through this conversation, while it still is a very traumatic event, she began to see some of the positives that came out of that event at the same time. And she started crying, and everybody in the entire room started crying. And those are, of course, very major traumatic events. And when we look at that, we're going, how could anything positive come out of any of those things? But on the flip side of the coin, too, when we kind of loop this, back into business, my team kind of looks at me like I've been smoking the wacky tobacco. When things happen in the company, let's say we lose a client, and I stop and I ask them, why could this be the best thing in the world that could happen to us right now? And they're like, wait, what? I go, remember, with every challenge comes with it an equal and opposite opportunity. So let's stop for a minute. Where's the opportunity in this right now? What happened? And it's like, well, we could have, sent out NPS scores sooner. We could have consulted with the coach. We could have done this. We could have done that. And it ends up building the company stronger. And on the flip side of the coin, with every positive comes with it equal opposite challenge. There are times when all of a sudden there's just this massive surge of business and things are great. And we think that surge of business, where can things go wrong?
Everywhere. At speed.
Right. Then you begin to realize that, as you get more business, it puts pressures and strains on the systems and processes in the business. And, as things grow faster, the faster it is, the faster you begin to see the problems. I want to, kind of share two little stories that a client shared with me last week. And I want to give this particular client credit. His name is Mike Ranfone. He's the founder of Ranfone Systems out in Connecticut. And he really does a great job inspiring his clients. And he told me two different stories that he shares with his clients, but the same stories that he shares with his clients in fitness actually applies to business people. The one story that he shared with me is he said, Charlie, it's 28-3. 28-3. It's halftime. You're losing. What do you do? Now, for most people, it's a matter of defeat. They have resorted to the fact that they won't be able to win. They're so far behind, the odds of them winning are minuscule. So they're already starting to scale back and accept the defeat. If the Patriots accepted defeat in the Super Bowl against the Falcons, they never would have won as they did. They came back in the second half and they crushed the Falcons and they won the Super Bowl. And it was because they realized that, they could win and they were going to give it them all. Meanwhile, the Falcons took their foot off the gas pedal, figuring that they had it in the bag.
Defeat frees you. That if you experience a defeating event, that means, okay, if you're already going to lose, you might as well try something, or you might as well play as hard as you can because you've already lost.
Yeah.
As opposed to I should go play it safe now. No, you shouldn't. You've already lost. You might as well. You're already going bankrupt, going to jail, whatever the bad outcome is. So just get after it.
Yeah, that is so true. And then, the other thing that he also shared with me was, and I'm going to ask you this question, Brian, because he asked me this. All right, real quick. You ready?
Go for it.
Where are races won?
At least the night to the decade before.
So, and I was thinking very similar to the way that you said, but you know what he said? Races are won in the middle. People start off with a whole bunch of other people and they get out of the gates and it's easy. But then the crowd starts thinning and it gets harder. And you're on your own and it gets hard. Those who are willing to bite down, do what it takes, push through it, end up winning at the end of the race. Folks, right now, we're in a discerning market environment. This is where we're in the middle of the race. This race will come to an end. Whether you win or lose is going to be determined on how you race in the middle. And that's where we're at now. Are you going to lean in? Are you going to be more strategic? Are you going to take advantage of the opportunities that are available to you right now? Are you going to have the tenacity, the willpower, the grit to be able to push through this? And if you could do that, you're going to win. Because right now, in a discerning market environment, guess what? It's supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be hard. But it doesn't mean that you're supposed to suffer. It doesn't mean that your business is supposed to go down. No, that is not what it means. You have every opportunity available to you right now, and you can take advantage of it. The right mindset, with the right approach, this is the middle of the race. You can win it at the end.
Well, I'm sold. And folks, if you're sold too, go to predictableprofits.com to find out what you've been sold on. Get the book, Predictable Profits Playbook. Listen to the podcast, Beyond Seven Figures. Charles Gaudet, thank you for being back on the show for episode number 4.
My pleasure.